First of all, thank you, Wayne. And secondly, all of you should get very comfortable. I was a high school teacher for 33 years, so I'm used to talking for 5 hours a day. So get settled. So I was kind of perplexed about what the title is today, but it just settled on one that's real common that I like to give, and that this is about Native American perspectives on the environment, and especially nowadays with the climate change, it's really important to understand how Native people have viewed our environment for the last 13,000 years that we've been around. So first of all, I want to express my gratitude to the Wintun Nation on whose land we meet today. The Wintun Nation is located right here, this in the green. I'm a member of the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria, and our territory is over here just north of San Francisco Bay in Marin County and Sonoma County, so it's all wine country now and very expensive to live. And when people say, because we built a casino, they said, you shouldn't be building that casino. I said, that's fine, won't build a casino if you give me 1 acre of land along the coast. And I haven't seen that acre of land yet. So very briefly, what I'm going to talk about is tribal culture and beliefs, cultural differences, the importance of time and place, and a little bit about the fourth California State Climate Change Assessment, which was done last August. So any of you here been to Bodega Bay, Bodega? It's located over on the Sonoma coast. What you see is a picture looking north. Within that picture frame is our tribe's creation place. The Bodega Marine Lab was mentioned earlier in the program. That's located there. The local utility company wanted to build a nuclear power plant there, and they dug the foundation and everything, but then they hit the San Andreas Fault, and they decided that was probably going to be a bad place to build a nuclear reactor. So I like this little quote. It was a land where birds, clouds, and stones spoke clearly as people, because the silent language of nature was profoundly understood. And this expresses the core of Native American beliefs. I give a lot of speeches to 3rd and 4th grade classes about the local Native people, and I find the best way to explain the Native cultural belief is through Yoda. So Yoda is one of my heroes. So basically Yoda said that there's a force in everything. There's a spirit in everything. And that spirit can be good or bad, but there's a spirit in everything. And kids understand Yoda. They may not understand me, but they understand Yoda. So the essence of our belief is that everything in the environment is spiritual, that all the elements have a spirit, and more importantly, that all of those elements are equal to the spirit of humans. Now think about that a minute. We heard this day, we've heard a lot of science and a lot of investigations and categories and research and so forth. But for Native people, it's not that simple. It's more about all of these things in our environment are part of us. They're part of our ancestry. They'll be part of our descendants. So we have to respect them all and keep them all in balance. So as an example of how people around the world feel about this connectivity and spirituality of the environment, and you should recognize this picture, so recently several tribes around the world gave full citizenship rights, tribal rights, to rivers, and other things have been happening. So this is an example of the Maori in New Zealand, but also tribes in India have given the Ganges that kind of special relationship to them. So I like to talk to groups about the difference in the Western view of science and the indigenous view. So the Western view is you find something, you study it, you photograph it, you put it in a table, you put it in a spreadsheet, you examine it until you can't examine it anymore. And that's important. I was a chemistry major in college. I like science. But the indigenous view is fundamentally different. And when you have to work with tribes, and a lot of you are with government agencies and have to consult with tribes over various things, when you deal with tribes, you have to understand that you're talking to people who look at things from a totally different worldview. You also have to understand that tribes have this traditional ecological knowledge that they've amassed over the last 13,000 years, that by sitting and watching how plants change over the seasons, how they interrelate to each other, if you do this to one plant, how that affects other plants. They've studied this for 13,000 years, so they're pretty familiar with that whole system. And that's how indigenous people managed the land. And a lot of people forget that indigenous people have been managing the land they lived on for 13,000 years, and including using fire, and I'll get to that in a second. Traditional ecological knowledge, a good example is a lot of people believe that California Indians ate acorn mush for their 100% of their diet, which isn't true. They only ate it 20% of their diet, and I don't like it. To me, it's like poi, and I don't like poi either. But anyway, the deal is that this one tree, this valley oak, has the ability to provide native people with all kinds of things besides acorns, medicines and tools and so forth. And the native people learned that if they burned a certain time of the year, that one of the things that would happen is the larvae that get into the acorns and then fall and then turn into moths and get back up to the top of the tree, that a fire burned at a certain time of the year would stop that cycle. So when you hear people talking about Native American burning, it's not just burning for fuel load reduction. It is about a specific time and a specific way to improve the health of plants. So land management by Native people was greatly changed throughout the world, but specifically in California, when the colonists came in California, the missions came and restricted how the movement of Native people and what they could do. In fact, the use of fire by Native people was actually banned by the U.S. in 1911. You also need to know, when you deal, for those of you in government agencies who deal with tribes, you need to know about the doctrine of discovery. And this was what I call the cover for colonization and the Crusades. So the doctrine of discovery was written by the Catholic Church to justify colonists going to other countries and killing people, taking their culture, enslaving them. It became a Catholic church bull. So for those of you who are Catholic know what that means. In the U.S., we call it manifest destiny. And actually, the doctrine of discovery was adopted by the U.S. Supreme Court. So it technically is still in law. That's important because as climate changes and because of our relationship with the environment, we are losing our culture. And you think about, in today's terms, if the things that are important to you to do for fun and that are culturally appropriate, if that was all threatened, how would you feel how would you feel and what would you do about it if you could do anything? So it's, again, an emotional, spiritual issue. And so tribes now are beginning to look at, if we lose the oak trees to sudden oak death or to whatever, how is that going to affect our culture? We don't know, but it's beginning to scare a lot of tribes. And that's why you see tribes being more interested in environmental changes and to pay more attention, to be more politically active. So about 3 weeks ago, the current California governor called a press conference, and he decided to tell the public that he wanted to correct the record, that the first California governor back in 1852 put out a bounty on Native American scalps. So people were encouraged to turn in scalps, and they were paid $50 apiece. So the word that's used is genocide, that although a lot of people like to avoid using that word because of its political implications. But for Native people, that's the word that we use. So I mentioned that there was California had a climate change assessment forum last August. And these are some of the statistics that the state has determined. And the state was divided up into different regions and then looked at these things and see how they would affect it. And the audience was cities and counties and public agencies in California so they could begin to do something about climate change. One of the interesting ones there is I live in Santa Rosa, which was partially burned by one of the wildfires a couple of years ago. So they're saying that by 2100, the amount of acreage burned by these wildfires in California is going to go up by 77%. One of the interesting things that's always our tribe points out is in our native language, in the Coast Miwok language, we have no word for wilderness. And the reason we have no word is that the wilderness, the environment, nature is our home. So we had to learn how to understand it, how it interacts with itself, how we interact with it in order to survive. One quick comment, a little story. So when John Muir discovers Yosemite, he walks into the valley and he says, this is just like a park, because all the brush is burned out the bottom and it's very park-like. Well, what he didn't understand is that the Sierra Miwok had lived there for thousands of years and had been burning, and the burning created the park-like setting. So Muir's first thing is to found the Sierra Club that then wanted to ban burning. And so by doing that, it started this system now where we don't do any burning, we don't do any land management, and we have these huge wildfires. So we have to be careful and understand what we're going to do and why we're going to do it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ka nui te mihi kia koutou I tēnei ahi. Ko waia hau, ko remutaka te maunga, ko paku rātahi te awa, ko ngaitahu te iwi, ko Ngāti hui rapa te hapu, ko Gujarati hoki a hau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. He mihi hoki ki te Wintoon Nation, te tangata takitaki o tēnei whenua, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everybody, I've come a long way from Aoteaora and it's really good to be here. And thanks very much Wayne and to the Soil Health Institute for the invitation to come and share some ideas about Indigenous research and what we're doing in New Zealand in a national funded program to develop a soil health framework and soil indicators in New Zealand, where a really large part of that program is dedicated towards developing Indigenous indicators for soil health and understanding soil health. So that's what I want to talk to today. I just introduced myself in my native language, one of my native languages. I'm a Mindian, I'm a Māori and I'm an Indian from Gujarat in India. But I told you that my mountain was Remutaka. I live underneath it. I have a river that runs through our beautiful farm, the Pakuratahi, and my tribe is from Ngaitahu, from Ngāti Huirapa. So I locate myself in my geographical context, in my landscape, and very much in keeping with the last presenter, I am nature and nature is me. That's how we see ourselves in Aotearoa. So what I'm going to talk about in the next kind of 10, 12 minutes is give you a bit of an overview into some Indigenous wellbeing soil indicators that really hold that representation of Indigenous peoples or Māori as nature. So I've been part of this project for about 4 years now, and I'm leading the Indigenous component of it. It's the largest funded national research project in New Zealand to develop a soil health indicator framework. So kind of hard to believe in New Zealand that we don't already have a soil health indicator framework that's in operation, but we don't. We're building it. And within that, because of the way that our country is recognising the harm of colonisation, the theft of our land, the ongoing loss of our language. Through our treaty settlement processes, we've had Indigenous knowledges recognised in a whole lot of forums, including research, science and innovation strategies. So you would not be able to apply, or you would not get funding in New Zealand for RS&I, research, science and innovation projects, unless you were partnering with Māori scientists, with Māori researchers, and unless you were able to join the dots between Indigenous knowledges and Western science. So that's the space that I work in. So our working question in our project is really about how might Māori values in relation to soil contribute to national strategies for identifying, maintaining and enhancing soil health. So that's our big question. And our hypothesis is really that if we were to have a wider understanding of Indigenous values as they apply to soil health, and if we were able to elevate the mana, so I'm going to introduce a few Māori words, so bear with. So mana is really the word for if we were to elevate the authority, of soil. So we just heard in the last presentation that the Ganges, the Whanganui River have been elevated to personhood status. So we in New Zealand as Māori would define that as elevating or lifting the mana of that natural resource. So in New Zealand we have, or through government legislation, we've given personhood status to the Whanganui River and also to one of our national parks because they are so significantly interconnected with the cultural identity of those tribes that through treaty settlement processes, the tribes negotiated with the government to have the status of those natural resources elevated to personhood. So our proposition in our research project, and what I'm deeply passionate about, is can we elevate the mana, the authority of soil, to personhood status, and then reframe the question to ask not what can soil do for us, but what can we do for the soil. So that's the premise that we're working on in our project. So I just wanted to pause and just take a little moment just to talk about methodology. I've had a really interesting morning listening to all of the presentations. I'm trained in Western science to postdoctoral level. I sometimes call myself a recovering academic. I've done my time in the universities and I've left now. But in our project, we're working with Indigenous methodologies, and we call it kaupapa Māori methodologies. They derive from critical theory. They're recognised and validated in New Zealand research and also too in international literature. And I just think it's really important because for me to unpack this a little bit because we're not really having a conversation, but this is a cross-cultural presentation. And so I have to be able to, I suppose, lay the Indigenous theoretical framework to provide the door for you to enter into to understand what I'm saying. So a kaupapa Māori methodology, like I said, draws from critical theory. It's research within really a Māori epistemological framework. Today we've heard scientific presentations that are in a Western science epistemological framework, Western ontologies. So the research that I'm involved in, this project, we need to step outside of Western science because I'm talking about Indigenous ontologies, Indigenous epistemologies here. So kaupapa Māori research is for Māori by Māori. I'm leading a research team only of Māori researchers. One of my jobs in leading this team is to work in that third space or that liminal space to kind of bridge Indigenous knowledge with Western science, which seems to be going okay. But one of the key things about doing Indigenous research is that it's transformative, that it's not research for research's sake, but actually it lands somewhere, it's with communities, it's participatory, and it has that transformational effect within it. So I just want to lay the ground for how we might think about soil. And I think probably this beautiful picture from Māori woman artist Teresa Reihana in a tribe up north in New Zealand, I think probably says it better than the words say it. And I said it at the beginning of the presentation, we are soil, we are nature, we don't see ourselves as being separate. It's not a soil's over there and we're over here. She is all a part of us. She is our deity. She is Hiniahuone. And when we stand in our traditional meeting houses, we greet our deity, we talk to Ranginui, our Sky Father, we talk to Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother, and we greet Hiniahuone, who actually birthed Tāne and gave rise to all of mankind. So the deity of soil, Hiniahuone, is deeply embedded in our creation stories and deeply embedded in our genealogies of giving rise to us within the human form. So now we've got to think about how we might put that into a soil indicator for a national strategy. So I live on a very small organic farm. It's like 15 acres. It's very small, but it still gives me a very sore lower back, bending over, doing lots of weeding. And I have worked with the Māori Organics group, Te Waka Kaiora. So we're a really small country, 4.5 million people. We've got 4 organic standards in New Zealand, and not one of those organic standards recognise anything to do with indigenous values. So probably about 10 years ago now, I worked with this lovely group up here, National Māori Organics Group, to develop a Māori organic standard, which gave Māori organic growers the opportunity to bring their cultural values into the way that they produce their food, but also in how they might tell their story out in the marketplace as well. So we produced this framework called the Hua Parakore. Hua just means a product, and Parakore means free from rubbish, so it's almost like a pure product, something that's from nature. And I've jumped to the Māori Organics because of the Hua Parakore framework actually provides a framework that we can take into thinking about developing for soil health indicators. So I know there's lots of Māori words on here, but what these are principles. These are values, that's what they are. And principles and values are only useful if we can walk the talk and enact them. So we talk about values, Māori values, as kaupapa, and that's what these are, or principles, but then we have to think about, well, how are we actually going to measure those? How are we actually going to implement them? And we talk about that as the practice. So how do we implement, or how do we practice these values? So whakapapa's genealogy, wairua is, spirituality, it's not really, it's terrible translation. Maramatanga is, it's another terrible, it's very hard to translate Indigenous language into English. Probably enlightenment, something. Maramatanga is, to see marama as the moon, and tanga is the act of, so it's kind of the act of illumination from the darkness. Mauri is life force. Mana, I've already talked about, power, authority, prestige, and Te Aoteaora is the natural world. So these are the values, the principles of the Māori Organics framework that we're now taking into a national framework for soil health indicators in New Zealand. So I'm just going to talk about 3 of these very quickly and just give you some examples of how these might land in practice if we were going to apply those through tikanga, through practice. So the first one is whakapapa, and whakapapa is genealogy. That's what that means. It's a layering of, well, it's about connectedness. So, when I came up here and started my talk, I laid out my genealogy through my mountain and my river. If I was in New Zealand, I'd be talking about my tribal meeting house, my tribal grounds. And sometimes people only have to say their mountain, and you hear the rest of the room go, oh, I know where they're from. So, they're real indicators of identity. But whakapapa also too refers to a layering of knowledge, a layering of different understanding. But really, for when we're thinking about soil health indicators, we're thinking about whakapapa in terms of that divine connection to Hiniahuone. And how do we do that? And so what we've been doing in this research project is working with tribal groups in different areas to understand their localised stories. So you saw that beautiful map of the diversity of tribal nations in your area. And so we have that beautiful diversity of tribal nations in New Zealand as well. And our stories, although you could say they're similar, we hold very much to the diversity. People talk about Māori as being one people, but we very much see ourselves as independent tribal nations. So there's about 120 different tribal nations with different stories and different connections to soil, different whakapapa or genealogical stories relating to soil. So we've had this beautiful experience of being able to go to tribal meeting places and hearing some of the very old songs, very old karanga or chants that Māori women do, where they're actually calling back to the soil. And so within some of these old chants, these old songs, these old calls or karanga, we're actually reclaiming or rediscovering new ways to understand the whakapapa of the soil. So we think there's huge potential in revitalising Indigenous knowledge by being able to remap soil attributes in local areas based on these genealogical or whakapapa narratives. Wairua is really about, well, in the organic standard, it's about peace and safety. But with regard to soil, it's what I said earlier, connects the producer to the soil as a resource-based, beyond soil being a resource-based input in a production system, to soil being revered and sacred. So how do you do that? A lot of our Māori organic growers say karakia or incantations before they plant. It's about having a connection between what's happening in the maramataka or the moon cycles and making that connection down to the earth. So you've got this balance happening as well. So we're working with Wairua, this idea of peace and safety or spirituality, having reverence for soil as a deity as one of our indicators. And then maramatanga, this one's really important. I think this one's really important because we've been talking about science all day, and I'm bringing maramatanga, this idea of divine senses, into the room, into the space where we're talking about soil and science and understanding. So maramatanga, our old people would tell me, is about our divine senses. Oh, divine senses, okay, what do you mean divine senses? We scratched our heads for quite a little while trying to work out how to understand what this meant. But this is really about, we hold our divine senses in our ate or our liver. And for a lot of Indigenous peoples, they hold their divine senses in that same place as well. But this is about being able to begin to cultivate as Indigenous peoples to reconnect with our own sense of knowing. So, I'm trained in Western science as well. But I'm also too an Indigenous person, and I also too have my hands in the dirt quite a lot of the time. I've been on this beautiful little farm for 15 years, and the longer I'm on it, the more intuitive I suppose I become in my relationship with the soil, what she needs, how I approach her, what I feel that I need to do in order to enhance the soil. So these things are going to be hard to measure. But I've got a really good team working with me, and just before I finish, I just want to say I'm working with fabulous Western-trained scientists, non-Indigenous scientists, who are really open to thinking about the methodologies we might use in that third space or that liminal space to bridge Indigenous ways of knowing and Western science. So our overall aim really in the project is to elevate the mana of soil, elevate the authority of soil, and we're advocating for soil to have personhood status in New Zealand, and then that will really change the way that we talk about soil and the way that we treat her. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.
I'm Klaus Martins, and I started out life as a conventional farmer. I went through the university system and learned how to farm in a normal way. And some of you might have lived through the farm crisis of the 80s, and some of you might be young enough to have just heard about it. But we came to an impasse on our farm. We were at a point where if we wanted to, we had a young family, and we had decided that if we wanted to maintain a good standard of living and a good quality of life, we needed to make more money. And we had lots of ideas for niches. Most of them were lousy. But we did see an opportunity in organic. And the organic market offered us a chance to get a higher price. Of course, we knew it couldn't be done. We actually went to the university and we said, well, this might be reasonable on a small scale for a backyard garden, but it's ridiculous on a farm scale, especially a farm the size of yours, which was all the encouragement we needed to go ahead and try it. We started out, though, by going to the Cornell stacks. This was the old part of the library. And the question I had was, if people grew crops before we had the inputs that organic doesn't allow, how did they do it? And it was really difficult to find books because they weren't relevant anymore, but they were in the stacks. And we went through and discovered some writings that were done by really visionary scientists who were there when the modern farming era started and who were questioning how things were, the new methods, how things were being done. They were saying, this is the right problem, but it may not be the best solution. This were people like William Albrecht. There was a German scientist named Bernard Rademacher, Sir Albert Howard in England. And they actually wrote things that were very thought-provoking. Back up a little bit, through my first 20 years of farming, I was disturbed because quite often the observations I made in my fields did not match what I expected, what I had been taught that I should see. And there was a bit of a disconnect between my observations and my assumptions, which I could put aside as long as I was making money. But once I got into this crisis where I had to do something different, it was time to revisit it. So to make a long story short, when we started looking at the organic market, something happened that had never happened to me before. We started getting phone calls and saying, how much do you need for corn? Or how much would you charge me to grow beans? That was a real shock because it's always been smile and dial and take the worst lousy offer instead of someone asking me, what do you want for something? So anyway, we had some very good early success. Using the old research avoided us a lot of problems. And things started working very well for us. One of the crops that made us a lot of money, and I like to quip that it was like printing our own money for a while, was edible dry beans. There was a tremendous demand and a very high price for growing dry beans. And this is going to take us into my first encounter with soil health. An observation about soil health is very much like human health. We kind of think about it only in the absence of it. We don't say, I'm healthy. We'd more likely say I'm sick or I'm not sick. And with the soil, it's the same thing. We don't think about soil health until we see soil sickness. So after a few years of growing beans, I came back and had beans on the same fields again, and they started having diseases. And I figured this was a lousy variety. I should have gone back to the old one. Of course, the old one didn't grow any better than the one that I had switched to. And we started digging in the ground, and there were root rots building up in the beans. And I was really confused. We'd been rotating 5, 6, 7 years between growing the crop, but all of a sudden I couldn't grow beans anymore. Our yields were plummeting. I went to Cornell, and there was Dr. Georgia Bowie, who was one of the pioneers who started the Cornell soil health testing. He was part of the team, and I was actually invited to be part of that team. Explained to me, the reason you've got this problem is because of how you've been farming. And I was all ears because we didn't have the tools. We couldn't use pesticides. We couldn't use fungicides. So we had to figure out how to deal with this any way we could. So that made me able to listen better. And he said, the reason you have this root rot is because when you've rotated away from beans, you've grown clover, you've grown alfalfa, you've grown soybeans. They're all legumes. These are co-hosts to the root rots that you had in the first place. Your yields were really good when you started because you didn't have much in the way of a pathogen load, but now you've got a problem. George did an interesting experiment. He asked the question, what would happen if we planted a different crop before planting the beans? And he did a random block experiment on a field that was infested with bean root rot. And in the experiment, he found that some previous crops made the problem worse, some were neutral, some improved it. And he found two that completely eliminated the problem. Not completely, but really suppressed the disease and allowed him to grow healthy beans, even in a crop that was infested with disease. And he said that the two crops were yellow mustard and buckwheat. Two different modes of action. That was my introduction to soil health. About that time, Cornell pulled together a program work team. There was a very brilliant extension specialist in our area. She was the vegetable specialist. She'll never get credit, but she was the driving force behind this. Of course, she didn't have the PhD, so somebody else has to get credit. But farmers were coming to her with very similar questions, and this was not just organic farmers, conventional farmers. We're asking her, why have our yields plateaued on vegetables? Why have our yields plateaued on dry beans? And she went into their fields and looked, and she concluded that even though we have the pesticides, they're no longer functioning because the soil is losing health. And part of her work now piggybacked on what Georgia Bowie had done, saying, how do we deal with soil health? First of all, how do we measure it? And second, how do we improve it where it's becoming a yield limiting factor? And Carol worked together with this large program work team at Cornell, and we started coming up with tests. George did a test, and this was the very first soil health test that I knew about that ended up doubling our yields. He actually took samples from a field, and he could predict what the disease pressure would be in the beans. And the way he did the test, he planted a very susceptible variety in it and then keyed out the root damage. So that, for me, that was an introduction. And our agriculture in New York has gone very heavily. We were the largest dry bean producer in the country at one time. Michigan supplanted us, and then it moved further west. We were the largest cabbage producing state at one time. And of course, we aren't anymore. We were the largest processing vegetable producer at one time. And the reason much of this happened was that our soil changed. From growing these crops year after year, problems started building up, and we weren't competitive anymore. So how do I take this problem? Now, we still have to make a living. And then working with Cornell, we started asking the right questions. Instead of asking, what pesticide do we use to take care of the pest, we started asking, how do we change our farming method to eliminate the reason for it being there? Now, I know I don't have a lot of time, and I don't want to bore you with the details, but I learned a principle. Well, that principle was that when we had an intractable pest problem on our farm, we could deal with it and actually almost eliminate it by introducing the right new species. Introducing that new species kind of reset the biology. Every crop that we grow, every plant that we grow in the soil changes that soil. And anything that we grow too much of starts having problems. What we learned was that we were actually creating an imbalance. We didn't have a diverse enough farming system. We went from growing 3 crops on our farm to where we now grow 22. The same process repeated over and over. Every time we ran into a problem, we discovered that we could solve it by adding new crops, adding diversity to the system, and using the power that the plants had to change the soil. The mode of action that I'm seeing, and this is fast forwarding quite a little more, is every plant gives off up to half of its energy in the form of root exudates. These root exudates are feeding a whole ecosystem of microbes. And these microbes are actually what's changing the soil. Was a researcher in Austria back in the 40s who did some really brilliant work on soil health back before it was popular, before people were interested. And what she found out was that when you plow a field in a healthy soil system, the microbes start rebuilding the aggregates, so that the aggregates that are broken are being rebuilt. She described the soil life as an aquatic ecosystem that lives in the water film inside the pores of the soil. But not only that, but the soil life was constructing that system and creating a home for itself, which was then being fed by the exudates from the plants. And those exudates were determining what microbes were in the soil. So to explain what we finally, looking back to the beans, what was happening, we had fusarium, we had pythium, we had rhizoctonia, we had nematodes, pathogenic nematodes that were feeding on the roots. And it was really depressing to look at these roots that were literally rotting off the beans when it rained, and then go to the pictures at the Cornell Library when the Native Americans grew their three sisters. They had roots that went 4 feet into the ground. How did they do that? But in that farming system, there was not the buildup of pathogens. It was a stable system that was able to produce fully healthy roots because the microbial balance was there. We didn't have one group of species turning rogue and causing a problem. And I think from that, we started learning how to look at what is the soil, look at our soil. One of the professors that I learned a lot from by reading his books was William Albrecht, and he used to tell his students, you've got to see what you're looking at. Another teacher that I had that really helped me was someone who asked me to consult with him. He was a stockbroker on Wall Street, one of the richest and smartest people I know, and one of the most miserable cusses there ever was. But he told me, if you don't ask the right question, you can't get the right answer. And what I found was I had been asking the wrong question. I kept asking, how do I kill this weed? Or how do I kill this fungus? Or how do I kill this whatever other pest we have? Instead of asking, why is it here? What is it about my farming system that has caused this to come out of balance with the rest? And then ask, how do I change my system so that this particular organism is no longer a problem? And I have found, and I do a lecture at Cornell that takes 4 hours on examples of how when we came into one of these problems, dry beans are only one, we could discover the right new organism to bring in, and it reset the system and the pest went away. And the most dramatic one that I can share with you, it's really neat, is that we had a problem with a weed called velvet leaf. Today, when velvet leaf comes up on our farm, it gets 4 feet tall and it dies. It gets velvet leaf anthracnose. It gets a virus called Albutin yellows, and it's covered with whiteflies. I had it backwards for most of my life. When I saw that disease, I was thinking, well, this disease is good, it's killing the plant. What I realize now is the plant had the disease because it was unhealthy. The disease was the opportunist that moved in and killed the plant. And I think when we're thinking about soil health, we need to look at our system differently. And then we can see something different, and we can start asking the right questions and get some insights that can let us learn new ways to deal with it. Thank you.
Well, there we go. Well, good afternoon. I understand that I'm kind of keeping y'all here, so I'll understand that. You know, when I was coming over here, I had a neighbor ask me, says, where are you going? I said, go to California. And he told me this joke, and he said, tell it over in California because it'll kill right there. They'll love that. They'll love this joke. And I said, I don't know. So I'm going to try this joke out, and realized it's coming from my neighbor, not me. I would never do this. But I kind of promised him. And, remember during the Grapes of Wrath, they had the great exodus out of Oklahoma into California. Everybody realizes that and everything. Well, according to my neighbor, that when that happened, it raised the average IQ of everyone in California. That's what he told me. But then he also went in to say that it also raised the average IQ of all Oklahomans at the same time. So, that's what he said. You Google it, it may not come up. As I've been introduced, I'm Jimmy Kinder. I'm almost sounds very conventional, in an unconventional way, farmer from southwest Oklahoma. Raise a lot of cattle, stocker cattle, dual-purpose wheat, various other crops, a family farm out there. And I think before you understand why I'm passionate about soil health, I think you need to understand where I've came from and a little bit of my family's background. I appreciate the heritage that was brought before us today, and being from Oklahoma, got a little bit of Native American in me also, so I understand that. But I need to go back about 3 generations on the Kinder farm. Many of you have seen these pictures. You've been around for very long. You understand that this was a dust bowl, and this is where I grew up, where my grandfather grew up. It was May 11th, 1934. A dust storm started in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. It was hundreds of miles wide, 2 miles high, and that storm traveled 2,000 miles before it hit the East Coast and the U.S. Capitol. Dust covered D.C. for hours. That was one of over 50 dust storms that occurred between 1934 and 1935, and many more were to come. That year, my grandfather, lawmakers, and citizens were seeing the beginnings of the largest man-made environmental disaster in the nation's history, known now as the Dust Bowl. All were overwhelmed. All were looking for solutions. And at the end of the decade of the 1930s, this was the damage. 35 million acres were destroyed from crop production. Another 100 million were severely impacted. In response to that, the federal government started the Soil Conservation Service in 1935. Today, you all know it as the National Resources and Conservation Service, and I know we've got several here today. This new agency gave farmers and ranchers technical and financial solutions. But no one knew if any of the new practices were going to work. Ideas like contour farming, planting trees into shelter belts were a few of the ideas that were promoted. My grandfather at the time was 22 years old. My grandmother was 20. And they were starting a family on a drought-stricken crop shear farm in western Oklahoma. My father was born in August of 1934. In doing some research for this topic, I realized that my dad was born between 2 of those major storms. Can you imagine that young couple bringing a new kid into the world, and this was going on? No solutions. We didn't have crop insurance. We didn't have all the society safeguards that we have today. They were out there by themselves, and they were going to have to do it. See, that dust storm came from our farms and other farms across the Midwest, and it was a dark period for our farm and the country. But my grandfather understood then, you take care of the land, and it will take care of you. And hopefully this is not the first time you've heard this. So began a 4-generation tradition of soul stewardship. Granddad told me and my father how the Dust Bowl changed him and his generation, how it damaged the land, how that precious 6 inches is all that allowed us to produce and feed ourselves and the nation. With the Soil Conservation Service, to use the latest practices of the day to protect as best they knew how the soil beneath our feet. My father then began farming in 1960 to 2013. He and others refined crop production in the area by not using the moldboard plow, trading it for a plow that kept the straw and the residue on the surface. Conservation plowing was called, some people called it trash farming. Contour terraces were built with technical assistance from the USDA. And these practices pushed conservation of the soil even further. But there was a problem with all these new production practices. It didn't completely stop the erosion. The best practices of the day were tons of topsoil better than the dirty 30s. But we were still losing too much topsoil to wind and rain. I played a little trick on you guys. That's from 2012, Oklahoma City. We now enter the 21st century. Every year around the middle of March, the winds kick up topsoil from the panhandle. I'm going to pick on the panhandle guys back there. And bring the topsoil my way. Make some beautiful sunsets, turns the day red, and puts dust on everything. Over the last 19 years, on-farm technology has developed to an exponential rate. We are seeing advances in genetics that allow crops to be planted outside their typical climate zone, smart sensors that talk to plants, and tractors that drive themselves. These devices acquire data at a rate never seen before. Education and technical assistance on the farm are more important to me now than any time in history. When I was in school, they didn't teach us much about the biology of the soil, and I'm an agronomist. We didn't know about the rhizosphere, at least not much about it. But from what we're seeing today and others, new emerging research, we're beginning to understand that biological information is flowing between plants and the rhizosphere at a rate we cannot fully measure. We know the plants secrete living compounds through the roots to serve symbiotic functions in a living soil. These relationships allow the plants to be more drought tolerant, need fewer fertilizers, chemicals, and while increasing soil health, yields, and profit. Today I need a way to test and measure and understand that ecosystem that I've had underneath our feet. But we've just touched the surface. That's a pun. The technical assistance I need to be smarter too. I use today USDA programs like the Environmental Quality Incentive Programs and the Conservation Stewardship Programs. These programs are flexible enough to allow area technicians and me to choose practices that make sense for my farm. Private consultants, land grant extension specialists, private foundations like the Noble Research Institute have all been on my farm, on my phone, and yes, sometimes Google's even called in. At Kinder Farms and most farms across the nation, the previous generation, despite their best management practices, handed to the previous generations soils that were in worse condition than they had received. We were better farmers than they were in the dirty 30s, but we were still losing ground. So in 1998, Kinder Farms started plowing. 21 years ago, we went totally no-till. We directly plant our crops into the ground, no seed bed preparation. The soil cannot blow if it's not plowed. It cannot wash away if it's armored by cover. And you know those March storms from the Panhandle? I'm capturing some of that topsoil, unfortunately, on my farm. Organic matter is doubled. Our soils are sequestering carbon from the air, reducing CO2 gases. Our soils are protected against droughts, floods, and winds. We're reducing our fertilizer and chemical needs. In short, the soil is healing, and we are profiting. This is a word cloud that I stole from Terry Griffin, the K-State extension guy. He pulled these off of popular farm articles. And when I saw this, I asked him if I could use it. I was looking for some words that we've heard a lot today. The only word that I could ever find that had anything to do with soil health or sustainability was the word cover about 5 o'clock. Those came out of popular articles. My point is, nationally, we've got work to do. Land stewards have to understand that we need to do better. We have to do better. I was talking to a young Great Brit farmer. He came out to me, my farm, looked around, explained to him about the Dust Bowl and why the soils had been degraded and what I was dealing with. He had farms. Well, at first he said, "You are so young." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You only have had agriculture, in modern agriculture, in your area for less than 100 years. And you did this damage?" He says, "We've got farms that are 2,000 years old, and we're still farming them." Nothing like somebody else viewing your farm in a different light. But through research that you guys are doing, I think it matters. It's got to matter. These measuring tools will be vital to producers. We must be able to quantify progress. Solid measurables will drive the real economic impact of stewardship practices. This quote kind of comes to mind: if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. This was a plow, or one like it, that my grandfather used. It's called we called it a one-way. I don't know anybody else got different names for it. One of the last conversations I had with my grandfather, he passed away in 2000. And so I was in my second year of no-till. And you got to realize I was the only guy there. I was kind of the guinea pig, right? And we had turned our farm to no-till. He was laying there in the hospital bed, one of the last conversations I had with him, and I said, "Granddad, you know, your generation and you started the plow." And I said, "I think I found a way to stop it." And he looked at me. He said, "Do you think it'll work?" And all I said back to him was yes. And then this thing came to me, that something that he told me everything about the man. He said, "Good." He spent all of his life plowing, knowing there had to be a better way. And so that was great for a grandson, and something that I'll always cherish and remember. So for the first time in history, we have the technical knowledge and the societal support to begin rebuilding soils. Rebuilding will be not quick or easy. but I believe it's doable. I will be giving the next generation a farm better than I received. That's important to me. But this story doesn't end here. The book isn't finished. Let's turn the page and let's start a new chapter. A brown revolution is to rebuild the nation's soul is at hand, and your charge is to give the next generation better than you received. Thank you guys very much.